Good evening, dear friends. It's wonderful to see you on the only semi-spring evening of the winter. Winter is coming in, so it's going to be there. But it's delightful to see you here this evening. When I heard Professor Nancy Rosenblum speak last year about neighborliness and the democracy of everyday life, I immediately knew that we had to invite her to share her work with us at the Mahindra Humanities Center, to participate in our Mellon seminar on everyday violence and nonviolence. I want to thank you, Nancy, for joining us. Nancy Rosenblum is the Senator Joseph Clark Professor of Ethics in Politics and Government at Harvard. She's the author of, amongst other books, Membership and Morals, The Personal Use of Pluralism in America, On the Side of Angels, An Appreciation of Parties and Partisanship, and Good Neighbors, The Democracy of Everyday Life in America, which will be published in May by Princeton University Press. I've learned a lot from Nancy's book and listening to her. Good neighbors do not necessarily make upstanding citizens, and good theorists of public democratic virtues are often laid low in their attempts to grasp the neighborly norms of everyday life. If civic identities turn on the politics of recognition, then neighborly relations are shaped by the poiesis of reciprocity. Of course, citizen and neighbor meet in the democratic customs and practices of everyday life. Both are, in a sense, the same individuals. But as Nancy provocatively argues in her brilliant new book, you can be the same person, but that does not protect you or prevent you from being a double-voiced subject. As a citizen, you demand equality. As a neighbor, you desire mutuality. The citizen finds security largely in the stability of institutions. The neighbor seeks solace in the give and take of carefully choreographed hospitality. Under adverse circumstances, the calibrations and calculations of neighborliness can go appallingly awry. Your neighbor can be a spy, a lyncher, a paranoic, or in Syria or Rwanda, a member of a murder squad. Neighborhoods are places of white flight, gated communities, refugee camps. Extremes apart, democratic participation demands of both citizen and neighbor a precarious and important double act. There are, Nancy observes, both continuities and discontinuities in the contours of our experience as neighbor and citizen and the meanings they hold for us. W.H. Auden understood only too well that neighbors may hold our lives in their hands, and even if he came down a little on the benign side, as he said, each for better or for worse must carry around with him through life a judge, a landscape, and a life, and a wife. Let me start that again. You can't mess with Auden. Each for better or for worse must carry around with him through life a judge, a landscape, and a wife. We fall down in the dance. We make the old ridiculous mistake. For always there are such as you, Elizabeth, forgiving, helping what we do, of every day in sleep and labor, our life and death are with our neighbor. I do not turn to poetry out of habit or happenstance. Nancy's evocative inquiry into neighborliness as a phenomenology of quotidian democracy derives from her humanistic interest in literature and other forms of narrative. Narrative is the most significant material and medium for the interpretation of everyday experience, and Nancy's insistence on interpretation gives her work a remarkable and lasting salience for humanists and social scientists alike. She writes, every move from internal experience to narration involves interpretation. The democracy of everyday life captures experiential meaning and contributes to this meaning. The traditional ways of thinking about neighborly relations are largely based on the notions of proximity, side-by-sideness, as a predominantly spatial metaphor. Nancy's rich and relevant attention to cultural narratives allows her to see the complex entanglements of temporality and territory in the everyday experiment of democratic living. In her creative hands, the spatial proximity of neighbors turns into a fine reflection on the existential propinquity of identification and alienation. Or as Nancy puts it, the democracy of everyday life alerts us to the limits of the political and to the anxieties of democracy. Nancy provides us with a persuasive and provocative biography of an idea, the neighbor, who, in her illuminating narrative, becomes nothing less than a reflection of ourselves. Thank you very much, Nancy, for being with us this evening. Look forward to your paper. All the very best. Thank you. Please, a hand for Nancy. Thank you so much.
Thank you to Homi for the invitation, to Sarah Razor for the arrangements, and of course to the Mellon Foundation for underwriting this seminar on violence. Take good neighbor literally. People who live nearby and contribute to or do not derange the quality of life at home. Neighbors exhibit solicitude and hospitality, but also unleash their demons on us, or in our view. Snobbery, betrayal, hypocrisy, cruelty, relentlessly barking dogs, blaring televisions, and excess of domestic odors, sounds that startle us at night and disturb our sleep, bedraggled yards, snooping and interfering, wounding reputation. You know it all. Proximity is cause and occasion for arguments, slights, acts of aggression. Family aside, we have no more constant or intimate stage for exhibiting graciousness or foul temper, or worse, than where we live. Everyone has a story. We express our bafflement, our incredulity at the misconduct or the sheer obliviousness of the people next door. And even if the trouble is long past and the neighbor has moved away, people rehearse these dramas at a pitch, as if they're talking about cruelty or betrayal, as indeed they sometimes are. Of course we tell our stories with feeling. These are not chance encounters. In Chang Rae Lee's novel, The Immigrant Dr. Hata describes how he became a known quantity in the neighborhood. Without even knowing it, he says, one takes on the characteristics of the locality. Their how are you and good days. There's a gradual and accruing recognition of one's face. There's no longer a lingering or vacant stare. You can taste the small but unequaled pleasure that comes with being a familiar sight to the eye. Neighbors are our environment. They're the background to our private lives at home, and when they give a strong dose of themselves, they appear forcibly in our foreground. And they can diminish the quality of our life, material and emotionally, every day. So the unique power that neighbors hold over us can be explained in a word. They affect us where we live at home. At home, retreat is impossible, and we're uniquely vulnerable at home because of the depth and intensity of our interest in private life and our expectation of control of that life behind the door. So our quality of life is vulnerable to neighbors' ordinary vices and sometimes extraordinary cruelty, and it's also affected by gestures of recognition and concern that mark our day-to-day encounters, the anticipated greeting, the unlooked-for favor. In some situations, their how are yous and good days are life-altering. And this evening, I want to make an argument, less an argument maybe than probe of moral self-reflection, about the meaning and value of these mundane encounters when life around home is degraded by mistrust and violence. And then we'll see ordinary acts of recognition and solicitude are noticed keenly. Their impact is indelible. And we know this from experience, from the testimony of survivors of atrocity and disaster, and from literature. I'm going to start not with violence, but with ordinary vices and ordinary offenses. Because once we understand what makes neighboring challenging everywhere and all the time, and take account of our repertoire of familiar responses to offense, we can assess their fragility under conditions of violence and begin to see how preservation of the rudiments of good neighbor are achievements. Our predicament as neighbors begins with the fact that unadorned reciprocity, face-to-face and open-ended, is our only foothold. The domain of give and take covers a virtually unlimited universe of interactions. It's largely discretionary, and the terms and time frame are seldom articulated. When is a return of a favor on the calendar? What do we do about unwanted favors? Put simply, no other sustained interaction, except maybe friendship, floats so free of the institutions and organization, the structures, rules, and processes, the shared purposes and agreed-on outcomes that define our roles and shape our relations in every other setting. The particulars of give and take are often uncertain when it comes to good terms, but our predicament is really daunting when it comes to negative reciprocity, responding to an offense. And you'll recognize the psychological logic that makes it hard, as one OED entry put it very quaintly, to repress all appetite of our neighbor's hurt. We think we accurately discern injury and offense. In our own minds, we're always innocent of inviting bad behavior. We calculate rough equivalence as our payback, or we fantasize spiteful revenge. But what do we do actually? Well, when it comes to neighbors who've forgotten the fundamental house rules of existence, most of us exercise restraint most of the time. We're selectively inattentive to doors left ajar and neighbors who park their car temporarily in our spot. We don't acknowledge inconveniences even if we detect a whiff of violence. We make allowances. We resist the impulse to magnify slights. Because we acknowledge these neighbors as decent folk overall, and we don't want to be like the woman next door who calls us out on every misstep, real or imagined, and perpetuates conflict. But at other times, indignation impels us to speak out. Moral anger, aroused by a neighbor, is exercising the power inherent in proximity to degrade our quality of life. And we report reprehensible conduct to others down the hall, and they judge the reliability of our reports. It's not enough for us, actually, that our neighbors sympathetically affirm the son of a bitch had it coming to him. We want them to make our business their own. So we recruit them to join us in speaking out against the offender. And I should say, I know, and there are some neighbors from this building here, because my book, Good Neighbors, began with a bully in my apartment building whose noise tormented the family next door. Do you remember this? No one should have to endure capricious cruelty, arrant, willfully imposed distress. Neighbors are often moved, as I was, to join the victim in speaking out. Direct personal confrontation is the resistance available to us. We're like Lockeans, defending against the arbitrary despot next door. Lacking articulated rules, authoritative interpreters, designated enforcers, we neighbors name the offense, blame the offender, claim the support of others nearby, decide on an action, and attempt to enforce our judgment. And in that moment, we're self-governing. We enact one element of the democracy of everyday life. Now, you'll say, what's true? We live in the shadow of the law. Zoning ordinances, property law, landlord-tenant contracts, association covenants, the unlovely law of torts, and criminal law. And when our neighbor's fence encroaches on our yard, or blight files the area, or harassing confrontations cause distress, we try to translate them into actionable grounds of complaint. Neighbors report to housing authorities. They show up at the Development Review Board hearing. They call the police. We expect, or we want, for every wrong a remedy, but the law is not seamless. All sorts of insults and injuries hold no interest for authorities. The offense isn't a crime. It doesn't rise to the threshold of a tort law of nuisance. The New York City apartment house manager who uses drones to search for unregistered air conditioners in the building actually violated no rule. Besides, appeals to authorities are complicated and costly. So in the shadow of the law, yes, but there's always a remainder beyond legally cognizable offenses. And for the most part, we neighbors are on our own. I'm going to skip a little bit here and just say that these familiar practices, reciprocity, prudent unacknowledgement of some offenses, rallying and speaking out against the arrant noise bully, adherence to local knowledge, are casualties of chronically assaultive conditions where neighbors create and people nearby must live with violence and mistrust. So now to violence. Studies document the conditions, usually low-income, segregated, often minority neighborhoods, that expose neighbors to chronic mayhem and danger. Physical defacement is the background for unpredictable, if not dangerous people, derelicts, addicts, prostitutes, rowdy teenagers, the mentally disturbed, and for vandalism and arson and harassment and theft and muggings and killings. Neighbors endure an environment of random disorder and lines of conduct drawn by gangs or hostile ethnic or racial groups. Police sirens every day. That's the opening line of Spike Lee's new film, Chirac, which I recommend. Isabel Wilkerson writes about 83-year-old Ida Mae Gladney, who lived in a second-floor apartment in Chicago. A man is selling drugs out of a trash can. She can see plain as day where he puts them and how he gets them out of the trash for the white customers in their SUVs. These drug-dealing neighbors favor Ida Mae, and they call her Grandma. They warn her when not to come out because they don't know when they're going to start shooting. And this particle of protectiveness reflects the arrogance that comes with power to wreak havoc and willingness to act recklessly. And the added damage for neighbors is knowing that these agents of destruction are living among them and willing to ravage even the quality of their own lives. So the fact that people living nearby are dangerous that most people living nearby are not dangerous doesn't allay anxiety. Life in the apartment hallway, the front yard, the living room with a view of the street is perilous. People stay out of sight lines, out of trouble. They walk hurriedly outside. They avert their gaze. And Václav Havel, who should know, observed that mistrust induces universal irritability, servility, perpetual defensiveness, backbiting, nervousness, and ever-smoldering compensatory contentiousness. Mistrust inhibits ordinary reciprocity, and it inhibits neighbors from monitoring common spaces and confronting delinquents and intervening on behalf of one another and rallying and speaking out. Sociologists find that disorder and neighbors' comparative lack of interaction are self-reinforcing, and they result in the demise of shared expectations for social control. So how do neighbors respond to violence and mistrust? Let me suggest that there are three common patterns, and I'm going to move beyond them. First, when Rosa Parks was mugged in Detroit, her neighbors found the culprits and subjected them to harsh punishment. Under degraded conditions, we don't always rely on a division of labor between authorities and residents. Neighbors deputize themselves. At best, a neighborhood watch is participatory democratic action, but self-defense is often a perverse version of the touted capacity for collective action. It's the provocative pose of enforcers driven by distorted perceptions of social disintegration and danger. Menacing themselves, they exacerbate fear and mistrust. And I guess that George Zimmerman, who wantonly killed Trayvon Martin, is the exemplar of that slide from vigilance into vigilantism. At the opposite pole is detachment. Mistrust runs so deep, physical danger comes so close, and ignorance of one another's intentions is so thorough that people are frozen in place. They inhabit a closed-in, closed-down physical and emotional terrain. Fear inhibits what we can call practical reasoning. It eliminates as felt possibilities the standard ways of protecting the quality of life at home. Habits of observing, speaking up, rallying, reporting belong to another place. There's no reasoning forward. Neighbors are numb. The psychological structure of immobilization is not perfectly rigid. It can be opened out, for one thing, by a neighbor's solicitousness and repeated assurances, and I'm going to come to this dynamic in a moment. First, though, a third response, this one rooted in mistrust of authorities and a sense of injustice. Officials' failure to provide basic order and protection fairly doesn't mean the coercive authority is absent. Acquaintance with the state as a disciplinary force comes early, Elijah Anderson tells us, and he reports surveillance, stops, questioning, arrests directed at young black men especially with crushing force. Being vulnerable to violent neighbors is intolerable, but so is being treated with contempt and cooperating with a legal system disfigured by racial profiling and more. So neighbors don't confront, and they may not actually protect the drug dealer next door, but they're certainly loath to deliver him up to the cycle of arrest and imprisonment and unemployment and reincarceration. So they're doubly betrayed by violent neighbors and by a government that leaves them virtually stateless. Their reticence, rooted in a sense of injustice, is quite different from those numbed neighbors who are fearfully closed down. Their response is expressive, it's alert, it's self-conscious, it's meaningful. Still, the field of possibility is limited. There are no positive prescriptions here, and the terms are set by others, by violent neighbors and mistrusted authorities. Now, nothing in my survey of common responses to violence, self-deputization, numbing, and reticence rooted in injustice, a sense of injustice, is meant to exclude political action. I'm a political theorist, after all, and of course, neighbors also organize and demonstrate and protest and petition and back candidates for office and run for office in an attempt to change the laws and policies and people that fail to make the world around them tolerable. A standard thesis, in fact, in democratic theory is that the neighborhood is the premier site of political education. And we know, for example, that some people who respond to social media calls for demonstrations by Black Lives Matter suffered or witnessed police brutality on the streets where they live. And several have now entered electoral politics. But I'm setting political action aside this evening. Activists who occupy the public square go home at night. And that zone of neighbor relations, personal and inescapable, is my subject. If we consider neighbors solely in terms of political engagement, agitating for a poop scoop law or demanding due process of law. The regulative ideal of good neighbor and its distinctive response to violence and mistrust are lost to view. And I'm making a larger point here, let me say this as an aside. After we take account of organized political life and work and membership groups and social circles and friends and family, there's this remainder. The elements of good neighbor, the repertoire of give and take we enact under ordinary conditions and try to enact in extremis, as I'll show, have a content and a zone of their own, proximity to home. Which is to say, as I'm repeating what Homi said by way of introduction, we're many-sided, if not protean personalities, for whom shifting involvements among spheres is not only a fact of life in our society, but also a condition for moral development and change, for compensation in one domain for deficits and deprivations in others, for experimentation, for individuality. Navigating relations in the zone around home is one integral facet of the moral uses of pluralism. It's not public political life writ small. Good neighbor and good citizen are not perfectly congruent. So if we see neighbor relations as valuable only insofar as they instantiate public principles of justice or legalism or civic virtue, we're going to obscure their distinct meaning and value for us, and I'm going to argue for democracy in America. The same thing is true if we flatten out good neighbor and reduce it to some general notion of sociability or moral decency. So, in response to violence and mistrust, neighbors deputize themselves to police the block, or they're numbed and frozen in place, or they keep what they know to themselves to avoid what feels like complicity and injustice. There's another pattern of response, an imperative I call live and let live, and this dynamic, I claim, is a defining characteristic of good neighbors here. In a gesture, a nod, eye contact, a wave, or a word, nice day, or a small act of assistance, we acknowledge our standing as neighbors' regular presences. We do this pretty much unthinkingly under ordinary circumstances, but under extreme conditions, these offerings are deliberate and they have added meaning. We signal that we're safe with one another. We won't disturb, threaten, injure, or exploit one another. We're not going to debase this neighbor or efface her by looking through her. We decline to erect walls or to refuse to deal. Our "how are you today" says that I'm not oblivious to how you are. We're paying attention. We're extending ourselves. And the contrasting disposition is this. We assume a menacing or a blank demeanor. We pretend neighbors are invisible beneath notice. And this avoidance is communicative, and it has consequences. The contact hypothesis, which says that simple interactions have cumulative beneficial effects, is aborted. There's no learning here. There's no accommodation. There's no appreciation of shared reality. There's no imagination or empathy. There are no willing opportunities, none, to practice interaction on terms of equality. That is, on the limited but morally significant terms of equality as neighbors and decent folk. And I'm going to come back to this again. So good neighbors grasp the damage that aversive, menacing demeanor wreaks on quotidian life. They grasp the damage done by numbed withdrawal. They know what they have to do. In the words of Robert Frost's poem Mending Wall, I have come after them and made repair. We're not heedless or insulated from our neighbor's situation and the sources of their misery, and we're aware of what we can do to exacerbate it and the simple actions we could take to relieve it. Live and let live is a creative response to an environment of violence and mistrust because it opens the field of possibility. And two things are happening here. First, we find new meaning in the colloquialism live and let live. The phrase sometimes implies a shrug of indifference or a caution against meddling, but not here. The imperative entails more than de facto coexistence. It contains a notion of excellence, good neighbor. We comprehend the significance for our neighbor, as for all of us, of the quality of life around home, and we see ourselves as agents and we offer assurances. The disposition to live and let live also entails an internal adjustment. We find in ourselves, or we recover, another way of interacting. Live and let live demands a certain discipline. Our overtures open us to rebuff, after all. Our gestures may not be reciprocated. So we call up resilience, a willingness to understand the value of these encounters, competence to do so, and hope that walls are penetrable. If not with this neighbor, then with another. Acknowledging one another as neighbors and decent folk affects inner life, as well as the quality of our day. What does this look like, really? Let me give you an example. In the many studies of events in Brooklyn's Crown Heights, we see the accident of proximity, unlike people living together, and the dynamic of live and let live played out. A racially mixed area, Hasidic Jews, longtime African-American residents, and immigrants from Haiti resided interspersed in blocks and buildings. In 1991, as some of you may recall, after a young black boy, Gavin Cato, was killed by the motorcade of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and young Hasid Yankel Rosenblum was fatally stabbed by a black teenager. After 3 days of riots, police finally arrived to restore order. And Crown Heights became a Rorschach for many, many years for pundits who activated every stereotype and cast the other in the role of historic oppressors. The boy Gavin Cato was a martyr in the struggle for racial justice, and Reverend Al Sharpton, who's since been rehabilitated, linked diamond merchants in Crown Heights and Tel Aviv to the apartheid regime in South Africa. Jewish commentators described Rosenbaum's murder as an anti-Semitic hate crime and the riots as a repetition of a Kristallnacht. Anna DeVere Smith constructed her play about Crown Heights, Fires in the Mirror, for interviews, and she calls it a search for American character, and so it is. Some political activists and religious spokespersons angrily underscored these divisions. Others designed arenas for dialogue to encourage mutual respect and commitment to the principle of toleration. Most Crown Heights residents spurned these organized events, but individually and spontaneously, many resisted vilification and tried to temper mistrust. Neighbors enacted the imperative that I call live and let live. A Hasidic woman put it this way: "Do you know that the blacks who came here to riot were not my neighbors? The people in this community want exactly what I want out of life. They want to live in nice homes. They want to have a nice, quiet life. My black neighbors, I spoke with them. They were hiding in their houses just like I was." Now, by invoking black neighbors, this woman avows a connection. And she does this despite the fact that the mental maps that Hasidic Jews and African Americans drew of Crown Heights diverged. And that in their imagined geography, the Lubavitch's neighborhood was a separate, sacred domain, the center of the world. But now this woman is acknowledging the black families living nearby as neighbors. She's aware of commonalities, beginning with, but not restricted to, mutual vulnerability. They share a reality. They share a point of view. They want to live a nice, quiet life. She acknowledges their equality qua neighbors as decent folk. And she is taking on what Angela Davis described at the time as the responsibility of learning. Reflecting on her own experience, Davis insisted that immersion in her community of black radicals wasn't enough. That we need not only the anchor of solidarity with our own, but a rope long enough to allow us to understand and learn. And in just this way, this Hasidic woman recalibrates who is my neighbor and assumes responsibility for the quality of encounters. Another woman gives the mindset of good neighbor expression when she says, and I'm quoting here, "I don't love my neighbors. I don't know my black neighbors. There's one lady on President Street, Claire. I adore her. She's my girlfriend's next door neighbor. I've had a manicure done in her house, and we sit in kibbutz, but I don't know them. I told you, we don't mingle socially." Consider her phrases in turn, what she's rejecting and what she's affirming. "I don't love my neighbors" dismisses the Old Testament commandment to love thy neighbor as thyself. It's as if she has reflected on its enormity and its psychological impossibility, which was summed up by Kierkegaard, who wrote, "Let us not forget its originality, that it did not arise in any human heart." In saying, "I don't know my black neighbors," the woman dismisses intimate knowledge. She doesn't pretend to know their thoughts or feelings. Their history isn't hers. It's enough, she says, to recognize that we have experiences and ideas similar. That's already a significant moral achievement. And "we don't mingle" falls short of social integration. In the same spirit, a black activist asserts, "I have no reason to be eager for the coming together of our people," and a rabbi insists, "My goal is not to give a message that we plan to work things out by integrating our two things." Simply, or not so simply, Crown Heights neighbors indicate that they will live and let live just as they are, however alien and discomforting. They admit the similarities of their situation around home, and beyond that, they deliberately, purposively recognize one another as neighbors and decent folk. Not everyone makes this offer. Here's a woman who, responding to the complaint from black residents that the Hasidic neighbors aren't so neighborly, that they rush around unconcerned with others without making eye contact or saying hello. "We're just as rude to one another," she says disingenuously, and she offers a justification. She says, "The morning, afternoon, and evening prayers have a time frame, Shabbos has a time frame, and that's why Jews are always rushing. The fallout is that people consider us insular, they consider us snotty, but that's just ignorance." She's aware of misaligned expectations, but makes no effort to avoid giving offense, and she's indifferent to being misunderstood. She washes her hands of these neighbors. To moral philosophers and others committed to more demanding expressions of mutual respect or principled toleration or social integration. Live and let live is next to nothing. It's not attended to at all, and that's a mistake. The importance of live and let live is what Pope Francis described as an integral ecology, made up of simple daily gestures which break the logic of violence. Like the old teacher in Vasily Grossman's story, who in the face of atrocity still asked, "How are you feeling today?" Neighbors mitigate mistrust and invite this iota of give and take. No public live and let live contains a hope that things need not be as they are. No public collective action, it's available to us on our own, and it's amplified by reciprocity. I think of it as the safety net of the democracy of everyday life, and I'm going to return to that in a moment. I've spoken about our repertoire of responses to ordinary vices and offenses, how it's diminished in a climate of violence and mistrust. I've said that live and let live is a residual of normality, a kind of assurance and hope. In miserable times, the situations neighbors face are much grimmer. The quality of life around home is deranged appallingly, near totally, when neighbors betray and kill. I'm going to give examples of this worse and the worst, but first, I want to make two simple points about good neighbors in atrocity-producing situations. First, there's a distinct quality, call it a moral temper, when it's neighbors who participate in atrocities or applaud the violence or turn away. The transgression has specific added meaning. We hear it all the time if you read, and we hear it in this particular cri de coeur. Was it inevitable that the Jews, looking their last on this world as they rode in the death train speeding to Treblinka or other places of slaughter, should have had to witness the indifference or even joy on the faces of their neighbors? And secondly, there is distinct moral temper when it's neighbors who assist and rescue, or even just stubbornly continue the modest, ordinary interactions that acknowledge one another as decent folk. Testimony to the moral impact of the quotidian word or gesture is always stirring. It makes for climactic moments in fiction. And I'm going to just read from Martin Amos's recreation of an encounter between a Jewish Sonderkommando and the wife of the Auschwitz commandant. And the voice here is the prisoner's voice. One morning, I'm in the lane passing the commandant's garden, and I see Frau Dahl setting off for school with her daughters. She looks in my direction, and she says something quite extraordinary to me. And I recoil from it as if I have smoke in my eyes. 5 minutes later, standing bent behind the main guardroom, I'm able to shed tears for the first time. Guten Tag, she says. Guten Tag. In situations of moral and political disaster, the good neighbor's ordinary reciprocity and disposition to live and let live is a moral resource. And the thread of good neighbor joins the mundane and the extreme. The sight of murderous neighbors that I examine is not a death camp, and the instigators of betrayal are not the Stasi. But in the United States, racism is the situation, and murder and betrayal are the story. Authorities enlist neighbors as informers, using offers and intimidation to exploit private knowledge as an instrument of political control. Officials condone killing. The result is a totalistic environment, because the zone of mundane life around home is erased when neighbors' interactions are radically politicized. And at the same time, and this is important, politics is personalized, because the history of neighbors' encounters plays a part in the selection of victims. A man informs on or kills his neighbor out of envy or greed or unsettled disputes or revenge. Grievance meets opportunity. Agencies charged with collecting information note that the supply of denunciation never seems to satisfy the demand. And that means rumor, innuendo, hearsay, or information leaked in spite. And the same is true of murder. Ida Wells Barnett, that one-woman anti-lynching crusader, listed reasons for mutilation and hanging. Lynching because they were saucy, lynching for a quarrel, lynched for anything or nothing. So America has a history of authorities inviting neighbors to betray and kill and making it simple to do. The mass Japanese internment during World War II is the American touchstone for betrayal. It's a story of public betrayal by government and personal betrayal by Caucasian neighbors before imprisonment and again at resettlement after the war. And that's not all. Japanese Americans organized an intelligence service of their own, quote, to protect the country and ourselves by reporting any un-American activity to the proper authorities. And there was treachery, too, among Japanese living side by side in the camps, who charged one another with collaboration, being stool pigeons, or reported one another for resisting authorities, They were known agitators. The enemy next door is a familiar trope in American popular culture, and for Japanese, it was a real lived experience. Neighbors abruptly cut off encounters in what amounted to direct personal confirmation that they were seen as enemy aliens. Betrayal by government, denial of civil rights and civic standing can be protested, resisted, or endured with quiet resignation. Neighbors turning away is personal betrayal, their immediate repudiation as decent folk. And Japanese suffered drive-by attacks by people from the neighborhood. Neighbors vandalized and set fire to property. Neighbors profited from the forced sale or abandonment of small businesses, farms, machinery, personal property, and homes. Judged by material consequences, betrayal by neighbors and strangers may be equivalent, but the experience has a distinct tenor. And in remembrances, if you read them, Japanese italicize the word, indicating incredulity and underscoring pain. Neighbors swooped down like scavengers. People, neighbors came and stole pipes, hoses, windows, light fixtures, floorboards, everything. The poet Maya Angelou was 13 years old and living in San Francisco. The Asian population dwindled before my eyes, she wrote. No one evinced sympathy or interest. No member of my family or one of the family friends ever mentioned the absent Japanese. It is as if they never owned or lived in the houses we inhabited. The eclipse of good neighbor is near total. And I say near total because the vestiges of reciprocity and the assurance contained in Live and Not Live survive extreme conditions. Some neighbors did what they could to soften the degradation of expulsion, if only just by saying hello. Caring for the family's musical instruments amounted to a declaration that despite public racism and official warnings of subversion, they continued to be regarded as familiar neighbors and decent folk. Some neighbors did more. There's a well-known case of Bob Fletcher, who worked fruit farms for internees and enduring harassment himself. And that's kindness amounting to rescue. So I want to make this point. If you read accounts, autobiographical accounts of rescuers and saviors, in every kind of appalling situation, these rescuers insist that what they did was not extraordinary altruism, but what anyone would do. And these rescuers very often describe themselves as good neighbors, whether or not the people that they assisted lived nearby. And I think this ready association to neighbor is not hard to decipher. It casts rescue as a reclamation of the ordinary. It evokes and it reasserts expectations of normality. It resonates with home. And my point is that under atrocity-producing situations, the valence of good neighbor works in two directions. It translates extraordinary assistance into what anyone would do here, and it assigns ordinary encounters among neighbors extraordinary value. Of course, general moral terms like decency and humanity apply to those who assist and comfort or simply refuse to turn away, but universal terms don't do quite the same work as neighbor. Neighbor is more than a homely synonym for moral decency. It's another layer of moral identity that resists the radical rupture of everyday life and reclaims good neighbor as a form of excellence. For the Hayashi family, whose nursery was cared for by neighbors during their imprisonment, it revived expectations of neighbors as decent folk and confidence that they would be regarded that way, which is to say this: America may exhibit the character of good neighbor nation even when it fails as a constitutional democracy, because the democracy of everyday life is rooted deeper than a public culture of rights. I'm going to step finally onto grimmer terrain of control through terror. Lynching is the homegrown American touchstone for neighbors killing neighbors. African Americans vulnerable to mutilation and murder by people they know, hoods or no, report as survivors of other atrocities report on the incredulity of the thing when it's neighbors who hold our lives in their hands. The experience of murderous neighbors is incomparable. It's the outer tail, the far reach of derangement of everyday life, because killing isn't sequestered in camps or on battlefields, and it's not mechanized bureaucratic mass killing. It's brutal and it's personal. Murderers knew their victims. Victims knew the people who killed them. I knew him, reports the father of the man who lynched his son. Me and him was raised together. Of course, strangers were lynched too, but underscore neighbors, men, and we should add women, who are a familiar sight to the eye. Lynching at the hands of persons unknown was a public secret that represented these feasts of blood as a collective act, at least insofar as every white person was complicit in the lie. In the line from Alan Tate's poem, the swimmers, this private thing was owned by all the town. And it could seem so. But neighbors were not all implicated in the same way. Microhistorical evidence is sparse, but we know that some, perhaps many, carry on in the interstices of horror. Neighbors black and white, warm, warn, aid, comfort, and sometimes protect. During the 1923 Florida massacre that burned the entire black section of Rosewood to the ground, white neighbors took in women and children to protect them from gunfire and got them on trains to safety. Had it not been for their loving goodness and concern, no one knows what would have happened to us, is from the memoir of lynching survivor James Cameron, referring to white neighbors who supported his mother during this time. Or this incident. A Klansman present at the Marion, Indiana lynching approached a 13-year-old black girl walking towards the place, put her in his car, and removed her from the ghastly scene. And she recalls his words. He told me they were bringing people out of the jail and was going to lynch them, and he says, "You got no business down here. When I hit my headlights that third time, you'll know it's me, and you run and get in the car, and I'm going to take your butt home." Now, this was his exact words. It's been said that the ethics of preventing atrocities are an extension of the ethics of everyday life. These ethics must be deliberately neutralized or overridden for abominations to occur. We know something about how atrocity is normalized, including constant affirmations the killing is owned by all the town. And we also know that socialization into atrocity may be tenuous and incomplete. What one psychiatrist has called a sort of doubling occurs. Well, with the appearance of this girl from home, the Klansman recovered his identity as a neighbor. Her familiar face returned him to the person he is there, where he lives, and interrupted, for this moment at least, unbridled viciousness. When neighbors, or anyone anywhere, resist the abominable, the language of humanity rightly applies. Every human gesture or act of generosity across the tribal barriers may lodge in someone's memory, Jonathan Glover reminds us. But once again, universalistic moral terms are imperfect substitutes for neighbor. The experience of neighbors holding our lives in their hands is incomparable, a kind of extreme, just because it occurs at home. And not just any human face triggers moral resources of good neighbors, this face, familiar but not family or friends. The ordinary vices that disturb the quality of life at home, the forces of violence and mistrust that degrade it, and the political systems that derange it are not safely in the past. Neither is the tremendous assurance of good neighbors. This resilient moral identity is a bulwark against the demons of cruelty and despotism, large and small. In America, good neighbor comprises a set of norms that, in Robert Ellickson's formulation, have no identifiable author, no apparent date of origin, no certainty of attention from historians, or we should add from political theorists. The American story was from the start a story of neighbors. Neighbor relations with its democratic ethos came first, and political development and legally enshrined democratic principles came later. So I think of good neighbor as the substrate of American democracy. It's sort of earthy material. Today, democratic citizenship is very well theorized, though not so well practiced. Good neighbor is pretty well practiced, but not very well theorized. And that's been my aim, to identify the elements of this regulative ideal, its appearance under ordinary and extraordinary conditions, its place in the larger picture of democracy in America, and finally, its interest for political theory. So my focus on violence is part of a broader claim that neighbors' interactions have a call on our attention. To affect the quality of the day, that's the highest of arts, Thoreau wrote in Walden, speaking about neighbors. And in the United States, this highest of arts is grounded in what I've called the democracy of everyday life. It shapes expectations, dispositions, demeanor, and our repertoire of daily encounters. This democratic ethos gives good neighbor added value beyond any general notion we may have as neighborliness, as friendliness or helpfulness or impossible love. So what makes good neighbor a form of democratic excellence? I can say just a word about this at the end. In part, its democratic ethos is a matter of rough parity in the terms of reciprocity, beginning with very modest give and take, our good days and how are yous, and we see it in the rough equivalence that we try to achieve in our ordinary good turns, in the way we calculate responses to our neighbors' offenses, and in the assurances we offer and hope to receive when we live and let live. But in part two, the democratic ethos is a matter of who counts as my neighbor in this dance of give and take. The phrase I've used, decent folk, appears very often in settler, in immigrant, and in suburban narratives, where neighbor relations turn out to be a persistent theme. Decent folk gathers in the qualities we consider when we size up the people next door to decide whether we're going to open ourselves to or wall ourselves off from willing encounters. It reflects a sensible, good enough assessment that they're trustworthy for the purposes of ordinary give and take. They'll do no harm, they'll take our elementary interests into account, and they'll be available for rudimentary reciprocity. And it requires, I argue, a certain frame of mind to see our neighbors in this morally significant but limited light. Decent folk is unromantic, and it's wholly profane. I want to push this a bit further. Decent folk signifies equality, but equality in just this one respect, as a neighbor. Equality as neighbors is a comparatively autonomous status, because what it entails is disregard for a host of social markers, disregard for our neighbor's origin and social status and class and work and religion and ethnicity and aspirationally at least race. Reciprocity among decent folk around home doesn't mean that we're colorblind or indifferent to inequalities and hierarchies everywhere and overall. Nothing so absurd is at issue. The profusion of sectarian identities and social and economic inequalities is a stuff of public political life, and rightly so. Simply, decent folk is a concrete assessment of neighbors, personally and individually, in light of our history of encounters in the context of home. It means that we decline to approach our neighbors as representatives or symbols. We do this often enough in the face of our own snobbery or prejudice or initial personal discomfort and across lines of division. Or we try. That is, good neighbor as decent folk is a fighting creed. So let me sum up what I've said. I think our quality of life around home is affected by gestures of recognition and concern that mark our day-to-day encounters every day. This we all know. I've also represented the democracy of everyday life as an index of political catastrophe. When violence and mistrust degrade life at home, when authorities invite neighbors to denounce one another or condone killing so that everyday life is horribly deranged, when the zone of life around home is erased or nearly so, we experience a deeper misery than we do from political failure and injustice alone. That is, democracy is disfigured in a deeper way than exclusively political standards allow us to see. The democratic ethos of good neighbor is a compass, I think, for maintaining our bearings when organized social and political life have lost their integrity or simply don't make sense to us. When public life is unjust or beyond our capacity to influence or so unappealing as to provoke retreat. When the mind is at the end of its tether with government and politics and with our fellow citizens, or when mindlessness rules, the good neighbor's reciprocity among decent folk and disposition to live and let live is a kind of resource. One that's known, accessible, contained already in our day-to-day encounters. I think that good neighbor is democracy's saving remnant. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nancy. You take some questions.
Sure.
Let me just start with, I think I need a mic, or maybe I don't. Let me just start with two. Yeah, come.
Should I come up there?
Yeah, please. Let me just start with two issues. One, what are the distances of proximity? How near must my neighbors be to me? In very practical terms, to actually be neighbors. Is this a borough-wide thing? Is it a block, 2 blocks, 3 blocks? I'm just interested to know about the distances of proximity. And my second question is, about the kind of good neighborliness of mafia communities, for instance. I mean, we all love watching Godfathers because we think this is really a very warm acknowledgement of good neighborliness. I adore it. It reminds me of being back in India in many ways. It has the same kind of subversive violence and deep affection, and I feel protected. So I wanted to know about mafia neighborliness, and I wanted to know about the physical distances that that count as neighborly.
Right. Well, physical distance, that is proximity, matters. I think what the internet and so on have given us, it led us to think about the death of distance is exaggerated, and that's certainly true when it comes to our private lives at home. So the real answer to your question is that it's not, that who counts as my neighbor is not a matter of postal zones or political boundaries or anything like that. It really is a matter of who is it who lives nearby who affects my life. So there may be neighbors who are quite close to you that you never have any encounter with, and there are others who you have a great deal of encounter with. And I talk about this in the book in two terms. First of all, in terms of imagined geography, because we have a kind of mental mapping that we do about the area where we live around home. Sociologists have used this technique of mental mapping to organize the sort of social structure of the city, and they ask people to draw maps of main landmarks and places. Well, if we did mental mapping of our own around home, we would see that we might have vast empty spaces and then clusters and so on and so forth. So there's no rule to proximity. The only standard is, are these people familiar to us? Do we encounter them? Do they have the capacity to degrade or to contribute to the quality of our lives at home? It really is a matter of face-to-face personal encounters and judgments. And okay, I'll leave that there. The mafia, I don't think the mafia is good neighbors. So let me say.
They look after you, they care for you, they protect you, they give you,
Okay.
cheap fruit when you need it, and bad wine when you need it.
Everywhere, people have neighbors, and there's give and take and interaction, no matter under what circumstances. What the mafia don't count as is anything like a democratic ethos of good neighbor. This is a hierarchical and violent social organization, right? And there are all kinds of hierarchical and violent social organizations. The point that I make about the democracy of everyday life in America is that what we're doing is disregarding these things, at least for the purposes of our day-to-day encounters around home. Whereas in the mafia situation, and just, in any situation where the terms of reciprocity and the nature of interactions is determined by a tribal elder, right, or an organized violent violent organization, or customs of deference and obedience, and so on and so forth. So, yes, everybody has neighbors. Yes, neighbors have some sort of reciprocity, but it's not rough parity, and it doesn't have the democratic ethos of ignoring these social markers, which I take to be the characteristic of the democracy of everyday life.
Thank you. There's a question there. Sorry, if you'd introduce yourself, please.
Leonard Katz, MIT. I think that neighborliness doesn't especially involve democracy. I think what you're describing is something very typically urban and having to do perhaps mainly with the urban West, where people come together on equal terms. But neighborliness can exist in societies that are profoundly unequal, and where caste or race are involved in expectations. For example, 30 years ago, as a postdoc in Raleigh, North Carolina, an African-American man approached me on the street and asked me for $1, and he started telling me that he needed to fix his bad teeth. And I handed him $1 and was about to go on my way, and I had grievously injured his feelings by, as he told me, just wanting to go my way and not engaging in the patron-client relationship that he expected me to engage in, which involved looking at his bad teeth. Now, I don't know if he was really going to use the money for that, and I didn't think that was my concern, but he wanted that narrative. I was his patron, he was my client.
Thank you, sir.
And
Thank you.
so that's a different kind of neighborliness, it seems, and I think in much of the world, it's going to be a lot like that.
This is exactly right, and you're asking in other more graphic terms, Homies, same question. That is to say, everywhere there are neighbor relations, everywhere there's reciprocity, the question of whether they're democratic or not turns on two things. It turns on who sets the terms of reciprocity and whether there's rough parity there, and it sets on, and it's determined by whether or not these terms reflect deference and obedience, whether they reflect the rule of tribal elders, whether what they reflect. And so you're perfectly right that neighbor relations in all kinds of places, including in some places in the United States, don't have the democratic ethos I'm describing. What interests me is the long history and the persistence of what I'm calling the democratic ethos of neighbors in America. You're right to point to settlers, but it's there in narratives of settler narratives, it's there in immigrant narratives, it's there in suburban narratives. Once you start reading, you see it everywhere. Let me give you a good example, a settler example, because this is one of the places where it really does first appear, and that is from Willa Cather's My Antonia, which is really terrific. She has this character, Grandma Burden, who's takes care of all the neighbors, and there's reciprocity, and it's really quite, as you suggest, quite an open sort of democratic back and forth. And one of the neighbors becomes dependent, doesn't do their shared, won't engage in reciprocity. Well, Grandma Burden doesn't withdraw, right? She says, well, we have to be good Christians, we'll treat them as charity. That is, charity is a demotion, right, from the reciprocity of good neighbors. Well, it doesn't exist everywhere, but it is, I argue, a defining characteristic of relations in America, at least as a regulative ideal.
Richard.
To ask something which is sort of connected to what both Homie and the last question are asking, which is really about, well, it's got two aspects. One is whether you can scale up the democracy of everyday life or the democracy of neighbors into political, what I would call political democracy. And related to that, whether the democracy of neighbors can be inimical to a more public, impersonal kind of democracy.
Yeah.
Precisely because, even if it's not based on tribalism, it can quite easily become a kind of tribalism. It's often the ethos of groups, ethnic groups within colonial or semi-colonial structures, in which I would include Boston. The Irish neighborhoods have had, at least in their heyday, that sort of attitude. And that quite how that gets transferred or scaled up, as I said, into real politics seems to me rather puzzling. And in a way, you move very freely between, say, democracy in the neighborhood, as if that's actually the same thing as democracy in the state. But there seem to be some very important differences.
Okay, let me begin by saying the democracy of everyday life is not political democracy or an antecedent to it necessarily at all. I'm going to answer this at length because I think it's an important question. By democratic, in terms of the democracy of everyday life among neighbors, I mean the sort of thing that I said. That is, we self-govern when we speak out and organize life around home, right? That we have reciprocity on more or less rough terms of rough parity and expect that we live and let live in this sort of appreciation of our equality as decent folk and so on. None of that necessarily has a political tinge to it. I do think that I am a believer in pluralism and the separation of spheres, and the democracy of everyday life that I'm describing has its place in this sphere around home. Now, if you're asking whether it can scale up, and I think absolutely not. And I think there are two ways in which democratic theory has tried to take account of neighbors. And one is, I think, a kind of sentimental account of neighbors and use them as models for democracy. That is either saying that you get your political education as a good citizen in the neighborhood, right, and then you move out to other things, or that the reciprocity of neighbors is what we should have at a national level. If only we thought of one another as neighbors and not citizens, we would have an ideal system. And I think that's wrong. I think it doesn't scale up, and I think that the character of neighbor relations has just about none of the elements of politics, right? Because, as I said very briefly there, the regulative ideal of a good neighbor here is that you are disregarding these differences for the purposes of everyday life. Whereas in politics, all of these differences come into play, and should. That's what politics is about. And so there's a way in which, I said that good neighbor is a is a sort of index of political catastrophe, good neighbor is also a kind of index of political inequality, right? And of social hierarchies. The other way in which democratic theorists ask this question is not to say, do we scale up neighbors? It's to say, isn't what I'm describing as good neighbors the result of democratic politics? That is, isn't it that we have all kinds of laws and regulations about good democratic relations, that they sort of filter down from politics into voluntary associations, into the family, and into the neighborhood, so that all of this is in fact a construct, right, of democratic politics. And I think, once again, that it's not. I think it is a quasi-autonomous zone. I think it predates politicization. I do think, and some of you have probably had this experience, that today, even neighbor relations are becoming organized and legalized. So some of what I describe as these spontaneous relations are absent. I've lived in a condominium association and in a homeowners association where you have legal covenants, where your interactions are supposed to be governed by majority rule. I mean, this becomes a kind of formal quasi-democratization. And when people challenge me by saying that, my answer is, if you've ever lived in one, you know how much of these relations fall outside the covenant. Right? You can't litigate your neighbor's cat.
Interesting.
Nancy, thank you for this really lovely talk. As I understand your project, you're trying to give an account of the moral distinctiveness of being a good neighbor.
Yeah.
And you're suggesting it's different from being a good friend on the one hand and being a good citizen on the other. It's something else. It's something distinctive, and the excellence of it needs to be accounted for.
Exactly.
I wonder if you could further your project by considering one other possible contrast, which is between a good neighbor and a good Samaritan. Now, the good neighbor comes to the aid of the person next door. The good Samaritan to the stranger by the side of the road. Mm-hmm. Would you say that the good neighbor does the good neighbor rank higher, morally speaking? Or would you say it's not a matter of ranking them morally, but it's morally distinctive in some other way? And maybe that it's not bound up or connected to democratic virtue?
You've done this very well.
Could I just say,
so what would
Jeremy
you say?
Waldron's article, Who is My Neighbor? It starts with the Good Samaritan.
Right. Well,
what do you say?
Right. So I do think that they're distinct. I think the Good Samaritan is a universalistic prescription, that it holds for everyone. You are to assist everyone, even your enemy, right? And most importantly, even strangers. Whereas the relationships that I'm describing, they're moral relationships. They are limited and modest in certain ways, but they hold for people who are, if not intimates, at least familiar to you, and they're part of the context of give and take around home. Now, what I will say, and I tried to, a bit in this talk, is that although they are modest and limited, they're not universalistic. You don't owe being a good neighbor to a stranger. And I have a lot to say about Old and New Testament accounts of love thy neighbor. Is that they are deeply embedded in us. I think in America in particular, we have an element of moral personality in which we think about being a good neighbor. And I think that our collective self-representation as a country is of a good neighbor nation. And that this provides you with a stronger resource in some ways than Good Samaritanism or a general humanitarianism or doing good. Now, that's not to say it's higher. It's just to say that it is different, and it operates psychologically very differently, I think. For resisting certain kinds of abominations and atrocities. That is, I think that you have to, there are many, many examples, both in literature and in memoir and so on, where you have to overcome a great deal to get neighbors to harm one another in certain ways. Whereas with strangers, it turns out to be easier. Now, is this always a useful resource? No. Does it operate in some situations? Yes, and the book is designed to show how, to give examples like the two I gave, or certain kinds of disaster situations in which only neighbors commit the crimes and only neighbors can resist them. And what is this resource that we have? I don't know if that answers you. Yeah. Emma?
I just wondered how resilient the theory is in relation to economic diversity. Because you can think of like a suburban neighborhood where every lot has to be the same size, and some people are richer than others, they bought their houses more recently or whatever. But that seems a very different situation from, let's say, a city block where there are huge differences in economic circumstances among neighbors.
Right. Well, there's obviously a lot to say about that. The question, in a way that you're posing, I think, is, doesn't this notion of the democratic ethos of good neighbor really work well under situations of homogeneity, and not so well, and I talk about black and white, but you're raising the question of economic. And it's certainly true that in the United States, we resist randomness wherever we can, right? We try to live in situations that we're going to find comfortable and agreeable, where we imagine that people are going to be like us. And one of the important points I make in the book is that we can never do that. It never works. I mean, people will have the same worst and the same best experiences in quite homogeneous and economically homogeneous situations than others. And in fact, the litigation at the level of affluence, right, or in suburbs is obviously much higher than it is in other situations. So whether my notion of good neighbor operates across class, right, and across, I think it does. And the evidence I use two kinds of evidence, really. One is, well, three kinds of evidence. One is narratives that I use, because I think you get the phenomenology really from literature and poetry, and not from, somewhat from memoirs. There's a lot of social science on this. And the situations where what I'm describing as good neighbor breakdown really are situations of violence and mistrust more than economic diversity situations. And the third is really experiential. I mean, in the end, and I haven't said enough tonight to let you know, but is what I'm describing true to your experience? Do you recognize yourselves in this account? I mean, in the end, that's the empirical evidence we have of an interpretation of this kind of breadth of relation.
Can I ask you, Nancy, just a question to follow on from Emma's question? And so I'm going to refer back a little bit to Richard's. There are boroughs in London where the local council buys a house and houses people in an area very dissimilar in economic terms, social terms, to their neighbors. I happen to have a home in Islington, which has such a place. It's fairly close. So this is the kind of an inducement to produce a democracy of everyday life amongst neighbors, but it is done as a project of, a certain kind of a larger democracy with a larger D. Yeah. How do you respond to those two levels, the small d democracy and actually instituted by the large D?
Yeah, I don't know Britain well, but the situation you described is really the situation in Zadie Smith's novel N.W. Have you read it? It's exactly this, where there is this attempt to democratize, and it doesn't really work. And I could show you the quotes from this woman who says in the novel, "I answer only to the landlord," meaning the lord of the land, right? And the women in her novel discuss whether they're really bourgeois. Well, they're not quite working class either. I mean, that is, but the rhetoric of class is so endemic, at least in what I've read, that the democratic ethos that I'm describing, and I gave an earlier, not this talk, but an earlier talk on the book at a Lee lecture at Oxford, and there was a lot of debate about whether this applied to Britain, and most people thought not. But my claim is not that this is unique to America. It's a claim that it is distinct to America. I'm not a comparativist. I don't know. Now, but let me just say a word about your question, Omi. I mean, I spent a year among social scientists who study these kinds of things, and it's an interesting question. I mean, they raise the question you did. Can you have political democracy without this democracy of everyday life? Is the democracy of everyday life, as I described, a cause, right, or a condition for political democracy. And I'm turning it upside down. Does political democracy guarantee the other? And your question was about the second. And I think that, in fact, they're quite separable. That you can have the democracy of everyday life without a full-blown democratic regime, and you can have a full-blown, God knows you can have a democratic regime without what I'm describing as a democracy. And the question is, how much can they be pulled apart? But that's really a question for social scientists and not
Yes.
for ethicists like me.
Great.
I'm probably not hearing this right, but it seems like you're positioning the good neighbor as sort of a bulwark against violence and as a source of recognition, which seem to be, these two seem to be at the same time perfect reasons for retreating from neighborliness, which is what happens in the United States, perhaps more than any other country, even though everything else is sliding in this direction, to lock yourself in your home, don't let anybody know your movements, don't let your kids go out. So it doesn't seem to be such a great argument for the continuation of this creature, the neighbor. Seems to be a better argument for the opposite.
Well, I tried to speak to this. I mean, certainly there are a number of common responses to situations of danger and mistrust, and withdrawal of the sort that you're describing is one, and it's perfectly understandable. But that kind of detachment is a sorry and miserable thing. And the question is, first of all, what are the alternatives to it? And my live and let live is an alternative way of dealing with this. And second of all, whether assurances from neighbors can move people out of this sort of condition of numbness and detachment that you're describing. But, I don't want to make good neighbor a panacea for violent and socially unjust situations. It's not nothing. That's my argument. It is really something. And all I'm doing in this book is trying to identify what it feels like, where we see it, and what is that really something that it is, under normal conditions and under conditions of extremity and atrocity. It's not a substitute for politics. It's not a substitute for justice. And it's
to counteract that movement, towards going inside. And locking yourself in.
What I suggested here is that the solicitousness of neighbors can help to break down the being frozen and withdrawn. Will it always work? No. I mean, a lot of this is about, because neighbor relations are personal and individual, they really are face-to-face relations, personality and disposition are going to enter in a way that they don't necessarily enter in other kinds of social relations. So there's no saying you can draw that woman out. I have a colleague who's written over and over these books about political democracy and democratic political participation, and he makes the argument, along with his co-authors, that in the end, what matters for political participation is whether someone asked, right? Whether you were invited. That's how you get into politics, whether it's a party or a voluntary association. And I think the same thing is true when you're faced with situations of mistrust and detachment, that to some extent it can be mitigated by someone asking.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I just wanted to bring up an example, which admittedly has to do with my experience of being a student in this town, namely roommates. I was wondering if that may potentially enhance your picture of what the duties of, or even simply ethos of neighborliness are. Because I think it's potentially a clearer example because of the ethos of a good neighbor. Because first, there's a shared economic interest of necessity. And second, whereas in the case of neighbors in the garden variety sense, tolerance is potentially just voluntary, whereas in the case of roommates, it's a necessity. Otherwise, something will break apart. So I was wondering if that's potentially just a clearer, more focused example of the democratic ethos that you want to locate among neighbors.
I don't think so.
No.
Let me say three little things in response to this. First is, I've given versions of, talks all over and all kinds of symposia and so on. And what I've noticed is that everybody has their story to tell, and they're always adults. That is to say, students and graduate students haven't yet had the experience, right, of neighbors. Really, you don't own property, you don't have children, you don't, all of the things that make for difficult neighbor relations. Now, occasionally it happens. You live next door to somebody who's a sociopath. You begin to see the problem of neighbors. But by and large, the more you age, the more relevance I think this has. The second thing I'd say is that really the intimate interactions of roommates are much more like the interactions of a family. And they're very difficult to negotiate, I understand that, but whatever the rules of negotiation are, and I think that reciprocity and other things apply, they don't have to do with neighbors. I mean, these are people you're sharing an intimate life with, and the problems that arise and the ways of dealing with them, I think, are quite different from the way you would deal with somebody who lives down the hall or down the block. You said something at the end that I wanted to speak to, and I can't quite remember what it. The beauty of tolerance. Yeah. Well, no. I don't remember something else. Sorry. I don't know if that answers you, but if you look at, let me put it another way. I've discovered that if you look at moral philosophy, there's nothing on this subject. Moral philosophers have a lot of very good things written on what we call special responsibilities, right? Obligations we have to people with whom we have particular relationships, whether it's family or friends or roommates. And I think that these notions and the standards that they use for special responsibility apply there. They don't apply to neighbor. And what's interesting is that sometimes moral philosophers say, just sort of automatically, friends and family and neighbors. And neighbors are, in fact, quite different, and that's part of the impetus to this book, to say, and I talk quite a bit about what moral philosophers have said about special obligations and whether they apply here and why I think they don't. But they do apply to your situation.
So you have to be of a certain age, and you have to own your apartment.
No. You
What
don't
about
have to.
landlords? What about the good neighborly? Do landlords mediate relationships between good neighbors? Are they important?
Landlords are important, but landlords, unless you're in an owner-occupied building, they're not your neighbor, right? They're exercising economic control over you. They're taking your rent.
Yes.
And I've never known a landlord who navigates relations amongst neighbors.
Oh.
Do you?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah?
Yeah. All the time.
Oh.
It's divide and rule.
Thanks so much, Nancy, for a really, really rich talk. I'm interested in what you said about the good neighbor ethos, that the part of what you could call a kind of good hypocrisy. The non-acknowledgement of factors that we recognize and the sort of forbearance from attitudes that when we participate in public political life on the larger scale are a part of our engagement and a part of our concerns. And I'm curious whether you think that that kind of hypocrisy is distinctive to the good neighbor setting, or whether we can learn from that type of practice in our broader roles as citizens, when we vote, when we contact our congresspeople or whatever else.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jonathan. I do think it's at the core of good neighbor relations. That is what I'm calling reticence or unacknowledgement. That once you acknowledge something, then you have to deal with it, and it's likely to create conflict, or if not so the judgment for when you keep something to yourself, right, is important. And it's why when I talk about good neighbor as a kind of democratic excellence, I really do mean it. I think it requires certain kinds of self-discipline and control. Do I think that reticence and unacknowledgement operate in other areas of life? Absolutely. I mean, it operates in the workplace, right? We notice things and we hopefully don't say it, because what happens when you acknowledge something, whether it's to the person themselves or more likely to others, you're more likely, first of all, to talk to others, is that then you have to recognize them, and then almost always it has to result in some sort of action. And so what reticence and acknowledgement does is it takes them out of the realm of action. And this has a lot to do, in the end, with liberalism and privacy and other things that I didn't talk about tonight. But
Nancy,
Yeah.
one last question.
all right.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a follow-up question from that. My original question was about anonymity and good neighbors. I find it a lot easier to live and let live because I don't know that much about my neighbors. But from what you just said, I wonder if it's not a kind of anonymity at the heart of the virtue of neighborliness, but sort of a willful abstraction away from the qualities that make somebody particular and different. And I know you said some things along those lines in your remarks. So I wonder if it's one of those, if it's both, if one is more important, if it's a practice.
That's a great question, Larry. I think anonymity doesn't apply. I think when you talk about neighbor relations, you're talking about people that you at least recognize. Now, neighbors are not friends, they're not familiars, they're not families. And the important thing and the difficulty of navigating these relations, which makes them, even under the best conditions, really quite a challenge, is that you are affecting one another's lives, or potentially so at home, without any intimacy. You have to have trust without intimacy. And the trust you have with people who are not anonymous, but who are not intimates or friends, where the knowledge that you have is limited, is a very interesting thing. And one of the things I do in this book is talk about all kinds of examples where we work on that. I mean, it's hard. But not anonymous, no. Once they enter your lives, for good or bad, they're no longer anonymous. You may not know much about them. You may not, I give some personal examples in this book. I use one about speaking out and, making our rules spontaneously. But I'm also not the greatest neighbor. I mean, I really do ask myself, do I want my new neighbor to know my name? No. But this is what we all go through, and the book is about these calibrations and how they operate.
We really look forward to reading it because this is such a kind of subtle and yet quotidian form of living. It's really important. Next time, I'd like to hear you on sublimation, repression, disavowal, negation, and as well as reticence. But thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Holmes.